Hey everybody, Cold on here with another VOX Immortalis commentary guide. This video is for Heroic Alysrazor in Firelands, and this is 10 man. You'll notice this video begins about 10 seconds into the fight. My apologies for that, but this was our first attempt of the evening, and I sort of forgot to start recording right away. But you won't miss much here. So the Heroic version of this encounter is very similar to the normal, tactically. There are a few changes, specifically for 2 or 3 ranged DPS on the ground phase. They'll have a little bit of different target switching. And then the Heroic version also changes the phase timings quite a bit. Specifically, the ground phase overall is a lot longer than on normal. The one new addition, really, is an additional ad will spawn during the ground phase. He just was in the center of the room there. And this is called the Herald of the Burning End. And he will spawn twice per sort of mini ground phase, which I'll explain in a moment, in the center of the room, and he'll yell and then start casting an ability called Cataclysm. This has a 5-second cast time, and when it completes, he will spawn a molten meteor on the top of himself, which kills him in the process, unfortunately. And this meteor will then start to roll toward a random wall around the room, just a random direction. If it's allowed to hit the wall, it will shatter into 3 smaller meteors that will then bounce off the wall and roll back the other direction, eventually hitting the wall themselves, and then they'll dissipate. That said, if any raid member gets within about 5 yards melee range of a meteor, they will die. It does about 500,000 damage fire per tick, so you really can't get close to them. However, the larger meteors are attackable, and they have a fairly small health pool, around 180,000. So you should assign 2 to 3 ranged DPS to deal with the large meteors when they appear. They can be slowed, so in our case we're using a Shadow Priest and Arcane Mage, who both have slow effects, obviously. And they're able to handle them pretty easily throughout this entire fight. So the idea is to kill the meteors, and when they die, they will become sort of an inanimate stationary object wherever they're located when they die. The raid will then use these meteors to block line of sight to avoid Alysrazor's Firestorm ability, which is the other new effect on Heroic. And you've probably seen this sort of line of sight blocking mechanic on dragon fights like Sindragosa or Sapphiron, where the player hides behind some object to block line of sight to something that would otherwise kill them. So as you saw just there a moment ago, the raid was behind the 2 meteors, and we safely avoided the Firestorm. A few notes about Firestorm itself. It's cast twice per overall ground phase, and you'll get 2 meteor spawns before each Firestorm. So if you miss one for some reason, you still can get a second meteor and not have to wipe on it. The Firestorm itself is cast basically from Alysrazor's location in the sky to across the room, in that same sort of directionality. So it's mostly just a matter of putting yourself behind the molten meteor, the shattered meteor, such that Alysrazor is opposite you. So the rock is between you and the bird. And that's all there is to it, really. Another minor tip is that you'll see a graphic on the sort of arena floor as Firestorm is occurring, and it tries to simulate the direction that the storm is going in, but it's not quite accurate. So don't rely on the direction of that graphic during Firestorm to determine where it's coming from. Just use the bird's location relative to your own, and that will work fine. So you see here we're in the tornado phase now. This is just like the normal version, except everything hits harder, obviously. So it's a little more dangerous if you take damage. But otherwise, afterwards, you're in the burned out phase. You get 2 claw shapers, just like normal, which should be interrupted. So in our case, usually you'd have your tanks do it, but our Holy Paladin doesn't have much to do for this phase, so he's interrupting my claw shaper. And this allows me to get a little bit of DPS time on Alysrazor here. And otherwise, just like before, at 50 energy, Alysrazor will start to reignite and rise up to attack the tank. So we have the raid stack up on her head while she's burned out. and with the tank opposite, and then when our other tank gets around 6 or 7 stacks of the debuff, I'll call a countdown and taunt off him, use a couple cooldowns, and then by then the phase is pretty much over. So that part is, and the tornadoes are really just the same as normal. The main changes to Heroic are really all in this ground phase and how you deal with it. So now the process repeats. So I've sort of covered the general aspects of the Heroic version, and I'll go ahead and talk about the more intricate details of each thing and how we deal with it. So for tanking, a few tips. You obviously notice that I'm tanking this fight, which is rare for me recently, but the hatchlings are spawned in pairs just like normal, and when they spawn, 4 worms will also appear at the same time. However, these hatchlings have low enough health that they should be killed by the time they consume 2 worms. So basically 2 worms per hatchling. Whereas in normal you would have 2 entire sets of 4 worms that spawn per hatchling pair. In Heroic it's only 4 worms for 2 hatchlings total. That said, like the health pool and tank damage is plenty. That you really shouldn't have much trouble finishing the hatchlings. So then you get the Firestorm after the hatchling and worm set, and then the process repeats. 2 more hatchlings, 4 more worms, and 2 more meteors. In the case that your tank DPS is a little bit low on the hatchlings, it's important that your tanks are still avoiding Firestorm by hiding behind the meteors. The hatchlings don't have a real dangerous cleave effect. They can use Gushing Wound, which does have a cleave attack to it. But since that ability dissipates when any target reaches 50% health, as long as other players are not getting hit by Firestorm as well, then Gushing Wound is never really in a danger as far as killing someone. So as long as players are avoiding other damaging effects, then the tank can easily tank on top of the raid behind a meteor if necessary to finish off the hatchling. You'll also notice that I will use Rake in kitty form just as the hatchling spawns, because it doesn't actually aggro for a while, because this gets the damage boost from the hatchling buff. I also use Thorns on myself, which again gets the damage boost, and that does a huge amount of damage. And then another druid specific tip for tanking is I tend to save Berserk for the 3rd hatchling, because it seems to be that the time between the 3rd hatchling spawn and the tornado phase is slightly lower than the time between the 1st hatchling and the 1st Firestorm, or 2nd hatchling, 2nd Firestorm. Meaning you have to have a little bit higher DPS on that 3rd hatchling to get it down in time before tornadoes begin. This could be just something I noticed that's not actually true, but it seems to be the case. So I just tend to save Berserk for that extra boost. So there you see I'm using it there, and this lets me finish off my hatchling really quickly. Other than that, tanking is much like it is on normal. Just tanks need to be aware of the debuffs on the hatchlings and prepare to absorb a worm when it comes time. We found that, like I said, the DPS requirement wasn't that high, so I usually just did it based on the hatchling's health. Tried to absorb a worm every 33%. So at 66, number 1, 33, number 2, and then he'd be dead before he was enraged. So we're back in the tornado phase. I should note that you can see the sort of pattern that I use for this phase. Most of our raid does as well, and it's really the easiest, is to just do a circular motion. So basically I pick a tornado, I follow it in its lane, and then when one passes to the side of me, I switch over to that lane and follow it, and just repeat this process. And it basically makes you run in sort of an oval circle shape. And this gives you the biggest margin of error by far. You can use a method where you step into one lane where there's an open gap, and then sort of Frogger style move forward to the next open lane. And it's the same basic idea, but by doing that you actually have a lower margin of error to react to new tornadoes in your lane. But by following one, then that gives you a little bit more time to react. So The other thing worth mentioning is that feathers obviously give you a speed increase, so any players that are having trouble with that tornado phase should be allowed to get feathers. There's plenty to go around, and actually I'll explain that as we go through the final phase here. But yeah, you can get pretty easily up to 60% movement if necessary. So here we are doing the second burned out phase. You can see Alysrazor is at 20%. So depending on your DPS, we had a few mistakes. Again, this was our first attempt of the evening, so we're trying to get back in the groove. But you know, depending on your DPS, then you may be able to finish her by that second burnout, at the end of that second burnout phase. Ideally, you would want to use Bloodlust for that second burnout, so that you can take advantage of sort of execute range effects. But we were, as we were learning this fight, we were always worried about people dying later on in the fight, so we always used Bloodlust at the first burnout, just to make sure everyone is alive. But if you can be assured that everyone will be alive for the second one, then that's a better time to use it. So I should also talk about the initiates a little bit, the ads on the side. Just like on normal, they will spawn the brush fires that you see, and then cast a interruptible nuke on random players with a dot effect. However, on Heroic, they basically do a casting pattern of 2 brush fires per 1 interruptible nuke. So this means that for the most part, even non-shamans can interrupt all the casts by themselves if they're not occupied with other things. That said, the first 2 initiates that spawn during the ground phase after a burnout will spawn simultaneously, 1 on each side. But after firestorms, then they actually alternate spawning. So I can't remember if it's right or left first, but it doesn't really matter. The point is that after the first firestorm, an initiate will spawn on, say, the left side, but the right side one will not spawn for a while. So in theory, your DPS from one side can actually help the other side during that portion if they need to. It's probably not necessary if you've planned things accordingly, but you can do that. Also, I'll talk about feathers and how we handle those. We're using just one player who's doing the flight full-time, which in our case is our Affliction Warlock. And so he gets the first 3 feathers, and then everyone else remains on the ground to deal with everything that's happening down here. We did try a few strategies with 2 people up top flying around, and that'll work, but you can get a little bit of sort of chaos from having a little bit of lack of DPS. So we found it was just easier with only 1 person up top, because the overall DPS requirement on this encounter, as far as killing Alysrazor before Berserk, seems to be very forgiving. I heard that the Berserk is after the 3rd burnout phase, but we never reached that point to actually confirm it. But the point is, you know, that's 16 or 17 minutes in, so it's a long, long time. So you shouldn't have any trouble meeting that requirement as long as you survive throughout the fight itself. Other than that, the feathers are handled sort of priority based on the meteor team. So in the first set of 8 feathers at the start of the ground phase, our Flight Warlock gets 3, and then our 2 ranged DPS are down below that are dealing with the meteor get 2 each. So this gives them 60% movement, and of course they can cast while they're running, so this allows them to deal with the meteor much easier. And then from that point on, after every firestorm, you get another 8 feathers. So by the time the tornado phase begins, pretty much anyone that would like a feather and a movement increase can have one. I think our melee even are able to get a few. Your tanks probably could as well, although I don't think we ever do that. But yeah, you can pretty much plan for anyone that has trouble with tornado movement to get as much movement speed as necessary. And just be aware that you may not be used to it in normal, since you usually don't have that much speed boost, and you can be a little bit faster than the tornadoes if you're not careful. So just something to watch out for. So we're about approaching the end here. Oh yeah, there she goes. So anyway, it's a long, long fight, but very similar to normal for the most part. So just practice that ground phase and controlling meteors, and you should have much trouble. Good luck, and thanks for watching.